Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they absolutely got it right. And this is Tom Navolis, your host, and I am so absolutely delighted that you are joining me again this week as we look into those mirrors of history. And when we think of recent history, I'd like you to go to samueladamsreturns.net to check out the archives and see what's been going on from all of the other programs. I think last week's program was a very interesting one. We had my good friend Adam Reddick here, and he kind of fostered a little bit as to what today's program is going to be about, as well as a number of the other issues that have been happening in the news that we have been seeing. And I want to bring that to light. So what is it? You're sitting there and you're looking at me or listening for those on the radio and saying, Tom, what in the world are you going to talk about now in these so-called mirrors of history? Well, for all of you that are signed up for the promo, and you can sign up for the promo at samueladamsreturns.net, there's a sign-up place there that to receive that promo once a week. In the promo, you will have seen that we're talking about Davos in 1776. Davos in 1776? Come on, Tom. They didn't have an elite meeting back at that time in history, did they? I mean, come on, be realistic. So let's take a look here and get a little bit idea who is this Davos thing in the first place, and then how do we bring that into perspective? Some of what we're going to consider as we look at Davos now in our present time, and then we reflect back into that period, actually from the 1760s and even earlier into the 1660s. It really drives on the whole idea of economics. And that's where Adam kind of was the facilitator on that initial point to bring this to bear, was that he was talking about where he's going to be finishing up his collegiate experience, that at a Christian college that has a really good political science and economics program. So that was real interesting to hear that and kind of talk about how do the two blend together and what does that mean. Economics is something that we'll talk about in the second segment and may carry back over into the third, is that it is biblical. So before I jump into this definition of Davos, I want to make a statement that will carry through each of these segments and be explored even a little bit more in the second segment, is that economics is God designed, not as a science, not as a means of manipulating people, but that when we look at the New Testament components of property and liberty, but then mostly as we look into the Old Testament as to what does that mean in relationship as to how God designed the world to function and what his plans and intentions were for the liberty of not only a group of people, but also for the individual. It is always tied to their function in relationship then to property ownership. And what do you do with that? Economics, we'll talk about the, simple Tom version of economic theory, if you will, but I'll drive that across from the more depth and broad perspective of economics as we see it from a community, and then as Davos sees it on this global front. So Davos is a group of people, political leaders, all of those who are concerned or think they're something, and they're usually a bunch of rich people, and it's very, very interesting. So The forum is 50 years old right now. So that is an interesting perspective in and of itself, that 50 years ago was the first Davos meeting. Now, we hear from a former counsel to President Trump, Steve Bannon, referring a number of times to the party of Davos. And when you take and you go and you look at their website, when you look at the attendees, it becomes a very interesting perspective that we have the global elite in many ways, especially the moneyed elite, coming together and thinking that they have something better to offer. Well, as I put in the promo notes and will be in the archive notes, is that Jeff Bezos, who is the Amazon king, New York Times, and a few other things in the media, this past week, New York Times ran an op-ed that the rich, the moneyed elite in this country, should have a greater say and perspective into who becomes president of the United States. Kath is over there shaking her head viciously when we know that's exactly what the founders of this country fought against. They stood against. They put the Constitution in place to be against that whole concept and perspective that we would have a ruling class that would take and dictate to us what would be. So we're seeing that, Bloomberg was another one that was at Davos. And here you have Bloomberg out there trying to buy an election, buying media time, sucking up things on social media, as well as buying people at great volumes in dollars to promote him and his campaign. And as I looked at the headlines, both sides of the political front, if you will, after Wednesday night's debate, it became obviously clear that Bloomberg was, just flamed by his competition. So it will be interesting. It will be very interesting to see how much the power elite has that influence. We know with Buttigieg, I will never pronounce his name other than that, Buttigieg is supported by 40 billionaires and millionaires. So he is in the back pocket of Silicon Valley, which we know is exactly that. They're silly and they're all con men in the way that they're trying to influence everything in America. There's a couple other good articles, and I think I referenced one on this book and this article where we can see that the power elite, more than in our recent time, have taken and influencing culture, influencing what we think, how we view life, how we even view our religious stances, or trying to destroy those religious positioning, especially the Christian religion. Nothing new. Don't be surprised. Don't be surprised in the least bit, because Davos, in principle, not in locational, territorial annual meetings, it was back in the 1660s. Huh? What are you talking about? We're going to get there. We're going to get there. But think about this. Think about that Davos, Switzerland. Switzerland was the core, the battleground for the Reformation. Switzerland was that place where Calvin was. Switzerland was where Zwingli was. Switzerland is where Knox ultimately went to understand and study those deep biblical roots and truths that then exploded all over the rest of the world. Switzerland had the battles over that. They had warfare over Christianity, Catholicism versus Protestantism. So what we have now is an economic battle, if you will, and the economy of it is nothing new. You have to remember is that economics, in a very simplistic meaning, is that capacity to be able to trade one's God-given abilities and the result of those God-given abilities with somebody else. Huh? What are you talking about? That's not economics. And, the whole thing with Davos, that's a bunch of baloney anyway. I mean, come on, Tom. Well, there are articles out there with the 50 years, is Davos any good? So they're in your references and talking about that. But in effect, what we will touch on in the second and in the third for sure is that Adam Smith, who is expressed as the founder of the science of economics, had some things to say about that global leadership. And at that time, it was that European leadership, the mercantile leadership. So when we look at the whole idea of those that are Davos, which is that coming together of the power elites, not only from the moneyed side, those that are the billionaires, the millionaires, but also the political elite, whether what country they're from, whether they're dictators, whether they're in some form of a pseudo democracy, if you will, whether it's a parliamentary environment or whether it's within the context of our constitutional republic. Donald Trump going there and speaking, once again, set them on end. He upset their thinking because the globalists have this whole intention of this free-flowing economy. And we're seeing with as much of it that has gone to communist China on American pharmaceuticals and as well as key supply chain components, we are now slaves to China. And quite frankly, Adam Smith describes that. Adam Smith describes that whole perspective of what happens when one group of merchants, if you will, those that would be that period of time of Davos mindedness, globalist, greedy, don't care, power elites, maneuver things in such a way, even within the concepts of so-called free trade, that what happens is that those that are not necessarily participating from their original design and perspective, and I'm talking about God's design, not some elite design, but if we're not functioning within that, then what happens is no matter what your political design is in your countries, in your townships, in your counties, in your state, the high probability is that you will become an enslaved people. So as we look at constitutionalism, as we look at what Sam Adams was fighting about, as we look at what the anti-federalists, and we're going to talk about Agrippa, what they were fighting for was that we would have that continued sense of liberty, not necessarily from the Scottish Enlightenment perspective, which is very predominant within our constitutionalism, but that of true founders' intent within the context of that Reformation liberty idea. And that's what Sam Adams was really all about, and those anti-federalists as well. So we'll talk about that some more as we come back into the second segment. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they absolutely got it right. And this is your host, Tom Navolis. And welcome to this second segment. And as we always do, I want to thank everybody at Liberty Works Radio Network for just a great opportunity to be on Liberty Works Radio Network, and then encourage all of you to continue to go in there, take a look at all of that other programming that is available for you, and pay attention if you can, learn something as you will, and then act upon whatever it is you learn. And as part of that action, look for that little button there that says donate, because this is a listener-funded network, and it is critical that you continue to help the programming and all the efforts of the liberty-minded people at Liberty Works Radio Network continue to fight the fight. So in the last segment, what we were exploring was Davos, and the fact that it's nothing new from not a term, not a name, not a place, but from a globalist ideology, an ideology of control, an ideology of wealth that supersedes everything else. And when we review some of the battlers, the fighters, those that were against that, we have to move eventually to that of the anti-federalist and some of what they were talking about. But before I get there, I'm going to switch it up a little bit, is that our friend Adam Smith, who again is the father of modern economics, if you will, he kind of brought it into this idea that it is something that can be studied. He uses that term, the invisible hand, which I think he got that all wrong. And then I want to talk a little bit here about, probably in this segment, I want to talk more about the idea that God has established what is and should be economics. So here's where I want to start. And this is difficult for many people to absorb, especially those that have gone through all of the public educational system, university systems, any of the educational systems. It's not talked about much, especially from the pulpits, because even the Christian colleges in so many different ways have succumbed to the idea of the humanist systems, even when it comes to money, even when it comes to economics, when it comes to trade, when it comes to many of the mechanisms designed to interact with that which is produced and that then which is interacted from that production based on need, wants, desires, and so on. Market development, we can put all the new terms to it. So in prefacing all of this, there are about 8 or 9 years, maybe 10, 12 years ago, as I'm thinking about it, I believed that there was a deficiency, especially in the present Christian communities, in relationship to understanding biblical economics. So I started to write a book. And as I was researching what that would look like, I did come upon someone who has written volumes written from 1973 until 2012 on Christian economics. So instead of taking and diving into it and writing, because I've already gone through the scriptural basis for understanding what it would mean for a Christian thought process in economics, I have to say that I can't find anything, no Christian, so-called Christian writer out there that has done a better job than Dr. Gary North. And the majority of his works are all free, online PDFs that you can download and read. And that's in the references as well. And there's volumes to read on what does it mean to have a godly economic system. And are there a lot of things that we can do or should be doing? So we have to start off with the most important aspect of understanding how this economic model would work. Because a lot of people go, well, Gary North, he's out in Never Never Land. He's this theonomist whack job and all of this other stuff. No, I'm telling you, when you study what he's written and when you really take the time to study your scriptures, you'll go, Lord, have mercy on me and forgive me that I am not doing what you have designed me to do. There it is, shock of all shocks. That is the first part that's taken me years to understand. God has created us. A lot of people agree with that. But God has designed us for his specific purposes and his good works, especially when we know Jesus Christ as our Savior and Lord and can understand that framework of what it means to have been created and designed by God for his good work. I have this conversation with my dad a lot of times. He goes, man, what's it going to be like in heaven? What are we going to be doing? God's designed us for his works. Do we know all of that answer? No. But even here on earth, in this place, we're designed for a certain work. Many times we don't get there. And I think that's the tragedy of the educational system, especially now, is it's not helping young people find what they've been designed for. I don't think a lot of us even looked at that in raising our kids. What is it that God designed our kid to do, to be, based on their personality and everything else? No, it's like, all right, go to school. We're sending you or homeschool you, and we're going to give you all this information, cram it in your head, and hopefully something will vegetate out of that excites you, and boom, off you go to college to be corrupted, even if it's a Christian college to be corrupted, and you'll figure out what you're going to do because you're going to make all these choices, and you'll have all these choices before you. No, that's not the design for Christian economics. Christian economics is that if you even look and see what happened with Moses and the tabernacle, right there alone was already these people who were talented. They were people that were craftsmen in one way or another. And then when they were brought to do God's work, on building that tabernacle, the Holy Spirit came and enhanced that which they were created already to do. And then when you take and you look at that and you understand that those people, those craftsmen, were doing it in dyes, that being what colored the linen, the cloth, those that were gold workers, those that were wood workers, those that were the various artisans, those that had known how to sew, those that had to raise the animals so that they had the goat skin covering, the farmers to get the linen to grow the right. Every person that participated, when you take and you look at the economics of designing the tabernacle, even before the artisans that went in and did the temple, when you take a look at that and what did that mean from an economic basis within the concept of Israel alone, that is phenomenal. within the concept of that people group alone, those talents, those aspects of what the people were created for and to do for God's purposes. So when we look at our systems today, there's no God reference in our systems today. And I think that is why I really enjoy and really appreciate all of the efforts and work that Dr. North has done, because he can take you through all of that Old Testament scriptures and move through the economic models, the people groups, the tribes. What did they do? How did they do it? How did you intermix? How did they trade amongst one another? What did they do internationally? What did they do with other nations? What were the prescription on how to do that, what to do with that, what not to do with that, and all of it that would be a people, a holy people, which Christians are still called to be holy people. We forget that. There's times I forget that. We all do. We're called to be holy people, which means we should function in every aspect. And that's why I always talk about what transcends every aspect of life within the Christian context is that we should be acting as a holy people in everything. And that doesn't mean you go to work to be a slave to someone. No, you bring those principles in and you take and you fight and you argue for the proper principles to be implemented that would not only do justice to people, but will also take and honor and give glory to God. I always talk about that in the whole form is that as an employer and having been an executive in the past, it's always how to make sure that the employees are best taken care of from a high moral value position. Businesses don't necessarily do that. Maybe small mom-pop shop businesses can do a lot of that, but when you start becoming a corporate giant, we have allowed the governments, the humanistic governments, to push things in that do not glorify God and are absolutely immoral, that then affect the business. There's a lot of businesses that are spending a lot of money they don't need to spend on all of these issues of human resources that then built into their financial environment that then impacts how they deal within the marketplace. So I think in wrapping up this section, the second segment, we have to consider that Donald Trump understands in some way some underlying fundamental principles of taking and not allowing us to be slaves. And what he saw was the fact and reality that China, through this party of Davos, through these people who have taken and become the players that we're going to talk about in the third segment that Adam Smith addresses, and how that has affected America, that, you know what, we're already slaves, and the Democrats and the elite Republicans are trying to keep us in that slavery by giving us the false concept of happiness. And that's what Agrippa talks about in the reference below, is what is it that can manipulate this idea of happiness? So when we're taking and we're battling now with this coronavirus, look at what's going on. The supply chain is affected. Medicine coming to the United States is affected because we allowed all of that to be offshored. Wow. Even Adam Smith warned that those types of things could happen if you don't understand that relationship of sourcing material, people doing various jobs, and what it means to have a liberty. And that's the real concept that Sam Adams was driving home and always fought for, was personal liberty and the liberty of the nations. So come on back in the third segment as we look at Adam Smith a little bit. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this third segment of Samuel Adams Returns Those Anti-Federalists Got It Right. This is Tom Navolis, your host, and I am so delighted that you are back with me, and all of those folks at Soaring Eagle are rejoining us in this third segment as well. Delighted to be on that network and programming every Saturday at 7 p.m. So at the break, Kath and I were talking a little bit about the whole fact and reality, how China has, through this party of Davos, consumed America and has already enslaved us, and that Donald Trump is the only one that's been out there fighting to return to us our pharmaceutical industry, our industry on electronics, steel industry, some of those other many industries that were offshored, that were sent away from us. And quite honestly, it's interesting is that now we can look at the party of Davos from 1776, because you've been waiting for that, I know, for the first two segments, and some of that comparison. Well, just recapping briefly, is that as Adam Smith was that Scottish Enlightenment type of person, those people in the Enlightenment still had some core Christian values, although they were starting to slip away. And as we know, as we see today, when you hit that slippery slope, you just go down into the pit of hell. And that's where we went. But we went there also in the 1660s and portions, as I noted a few weeks ago, around 1707, even at Harvard, when a merchant took it over because of the what? The trade limitations that were being put on American merchants based on what? Theological perspectives. It was like, why can't you keep it at home? Why can't you take and look at what we have to do here? But no, they wanted to be these global moneymakers. They wanted to play in the global economy of the day. You have to look back to that and take that into consideration. So what we have here, and this is from the work that you have below, is Adam Smith on the British North American colonies. And Smith at one point thought, you got to watch out for those American colonies, because what was going to happen is if the colonies were able to do everything for themselves, they would definitely break away from Great Britain. But the resources there were phenomenal. And we don't have time to get into all of the things that, he warned about. Don't let them clear their land. Don't let them clear all that land and all those trees. It'll hurt the economy. The wood would become worthless for the Americans, but then they'd be more productive in the agricultural side. And then, you know what? We can't let them take and have their own steel mills, but you know what? They could produce pig iron. They could produce some of those types of things and ship it back. So then we would do finished products and ship it there. That's all talked about, and what that economic model looks like. Oh, don't let them trade with other nations. Oh, let them trade just here or there. So what we have, and which we're taken off and then reinstituted, which drove us to partially that whole context of why did we go to war? It wasn't just about taxation without representation. It was a larger economic model that was moving away and moved away from that God-driven model that Sam Adams clearly understood, as well as many others that had that Puritan foundation. Now, those down in the southern colonies, those guys were already running, wacky on trading rum, getting rum from out of the islands, taking it over to Africa, trading the rum for slaves so that they didn't have to sweat out in the fields, so on and so forth. So, and that became an economic model. But it was immoral and a misinterpretation of the section in the Old Testament that talks about slavery. So that's a whole different world. And if you want to get a really good study on slavery, I got to tell you, go to Pastor Doug Wilson. Go find it on YouTube. Go listen to it. Go find it on his blog about slavery. And that's probably the best you're ever going to get on slavery. So, with all of that said, back in 1660, the English government had put on the colonies the Navigation Acts. They were based on mercantilist theory, and they were intent to direct, here again, direct, Davos directs the development of the colonies to best suit the home country. Modern Davos is not about suiting the home country because the elite, the political and the billionaire elite don't have a home country. They have a home pocket, okay? So that's the difference. So in that, what the mercantilist policies involved was that goods and produce going to or coming from the colonies were to be carried only on ships of the empire. Okay, only British ships. So right there, you're constricting how that trade can go in and out of a country. And trust me, China has that, even though they say they don't, but majority of ships that are carrying products in are either Chinese flag ships, Singapore flag ships. So go check that out. Point 2, certain specific colonial goods, among which were tobacco, rice, and sugar, were to be shipped only to Great Britain. You have to go do the work on that. We have certain goods that are only going to certain places, and then when we think about what then is coming to us, again, China is the beast that has enslaved us on technology sector, has enslaved us on a larger steel, aluminum. Why do you think Trump put the tariffs on all of that? Because they have the majority of those markets. The mother country was to have a monopoly on the provisions of manufactured goods to the colonies. Geez, Walmart, why is it that you take and tell everybody that comes in and tries to sell from you, well, the pricing coming out of China is the only pricing that we'll accept. And you know what? If you need to compete, then go build a factory in China. Go do something in China so that then you would have a market. Whoa, where's the mother country here? But, geez, where's the manufactured goods? 4, the colonies were forbidden to engage in manufacturers competing directly with those of the mother country and were encouraged to develop manufacturers not produced in the mother country. Well, so Bloomberg was going, you know what, don't worry about that farming stuff. They're all a bunch of idiots anyway. All you got to do is stick a seed in the ground, throw some water on it, and bing, bada, bing, you got what you got. Everybody needs to be a technologist. You know, when we were doing back in the 80s, some of the early and 90s implementation of technology, you know who was screaming for it the most in Eastern Washington? Was the farmers. They wanted to understand the markets. They wanted to understand the weather. They wanted to understand many aspects of farming that technology would help. Now, go look at a tractor. If you haven't been to a county fair, state fair, go look at one of those devices that are there. They are GPS run, they are laser run, they have high technology. The majority of technology in those things is all on hydraulics and on data stuff. Duh, Bloomberg. All right, Kath is giving me the high five here, so we're on number 5. And look at that, on manufacturing. What do we manufacture here anymore? Just a little bit. And the rest of it is all in China or somewhere else, in South America and Mexico, blah, blah, blah. 5, preferential treatment was to be granted to encourage the production of certain colonial products for the benefit of the mother country. Okay, Davos, what is it that you're taking and driving from this, what you think on this global economy is going to best fill your pocket so that you can direct not only the manufacturing functionality on a labor basis, which is a lot of what Adam Smith talks about, is labor and what are the equitable pieces in that. So anyway, we're running out of time. But when we take and we look at the whole commerce within the colonies, he goes through in this particular paper and runs through what other countries are doing, how they look at their colonies, how they derive things and mandate, where he thinks that England is being extremely generous and flexible within the context of even what happened there. Oh, and just as a reminder, Adam Smith says, you know what? We pulled a lot of those requirements of those acts off, and so there's a lot more that has the flexibility for the American colonies. But once again, those were reimposed on the colonies' navigation acts and others that constricted our ability. And when I appear in Sam Adams, I always talk about there where John Adams lived in Braintree did have an ironwork. And during that period of 1700s, especially as the colonies were starting to go, you know what, we're not putting up with this stuff anymore, they shut it down. They purposefully shut it down so that the colonies would not have a capacity to make their own steel. If you can't make your own steel, it makes it harder to take and forge guns and cannons and everything else that we would need to be able to fight against that mother country. Well, that's why we went to Ticonderoga and won and brought all that cannon home. Anyway, Agrippa is one of the anti-federalists that I talk about. Again, that's in your references. But he talks about the idea of promoting the happiness of the people by opposing all their habits of business and by subverting the laws to which they are habituated. Appears to me to be at least a mistaken proceeding. If to do this, we add the limitations of trade, restraints on its freedom, and the alteration of its course, and the transfer of the market, all under the pretense of regulation for federal purposes, we shall not find any additional reason to be pleased with the plan. And that's talking about the Constitution as it was, even with the basis of the first 10 amendments being added, that did not stop that whole perspective that the federal government, under bureaucratic control, which was an open door, could take and bring us to the place where we are when you have a swamp that is willing to sell out America for the benefits of those that are there, family members or the party of Davos, because they keep helping them get elected. And bigger than that is the bureaucracies are out of control. So Donald Trump is out there working at draining the swamp. There is so much more that I could cover on this, but we're running out of time. We're down to the last sub-minute. What's your action item? Is to understand that you are a slave. And the only way to fight the slavery of the Chinas, the Davos, and all of that is no different than our founding fathers. I'm not talking about picking up arms. What I'm talking about is getting smart enough and standing up, and you're going to have to vote for Donald Trump and everybody else that supports him directly. If they don't support him directly, you need to get rid of them because they're the ones that are causing the problems. And that's not only at the federal level, that is at your state and local level. So you need to vet your candidates, and then you need to vote for those that will understand foundational biblical truths, both in economy and in liberty. Come on back next week.